Okay, welcome to Chapter 4. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the issue of slavery, the issue of freedom, and the struggle for empire up to 1763. So some of the things we'll be talking about are slavery, slave culture, what it meant to be free, who could participate in politics, that's what the public sphere is, the Great Awakening, imperial rivalries, and then leading up to the battle for the continent up to this is all prior to the Revolution. This picture that you see here is a watercolor called The Old Plantation. It's by an unknown artist, and it's believed that this scene is taking place in South Carolina, which is where the painting was found. You see the musical instruments, the pottery, definitely of African origin. However, a lot of the clothing, European manufactured, kind of shows the mixture of both the black and white culture during this time period. So our first focus question is going to be, how did African slavery differ regionally in the 18th century? Remember in previous lectures we talked about the differences in the regions of the colonies. We have our New England colonies, very small, family farm oriented, subsistence farming, meaning they're farming just for themselves. The middle colonies, and then the southern and frontier colonies as well, differing with agriculture, lifestyle, climate. We're going to see also that this is going to affect slavery in the colonies as well. Probably the greatest contradiction of the 18th century was the fact that as the British Empire was expanding and celebrating their commitment to freedom and to liberty, they were also expanding their commitment to slavery. During the 1700s, during the 18th century, more than half of the estimated 7.7 million slaves that have been, or Africans that were transported to the New World, came during just this century alone. And we're talking about all of the Africans that were transported from 1492 up to 1820. The slave trade was a vital part of world business. In the 18th century British Empire, slavery, not wage labor, was normal. Slave plantations contributed greatly to the British economic development, and the first mass consumer goods international trade, things like sugar, rice, coffee, and tobacco, were being produced by slaves. And because as those products were becoming more and more popular, they also required more slaves. Through the Caribbean, we see the British Empire's commercial center really solidifying itself and it becoming the major revenue producer of slave-grown products. The Atlantic Ocean's triangular trade route carried British manufactured goods from Africa and to the colonies, brought to Europe colonial products including tobacco, indigo, rice, and sugar, and shipped slaves from Africa to the Americas. Most colonial vessels went back and forth from the mainland to the West Indies. However, shipping agricultural and other goods that the islands couldn't produce in exchange for plantation crops and slaves. Even merchants from New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island participated in and profited from the slave trade. In Britain, the slave trade also stimulated the rise of port cities like Liverpool and Bristol, and fostered the growth of banking, shipbuilding, insurance, and helped to finance the early Industrial Revolution. This is the title page of Equiano's account of his life. This is probably the best known narrative by an 18th century slave. You can see he's in European dress, holding a Bible, and what this picture is really doing is challenging a lot of the stereotypes of blacks as being savages, incapable of being civilized. And so you see the title, The Interesting Narrative of the Life. And you can see both his Christian name and his African name are listed there in the title. This is written by himself. So, interesting narrative, an account of his life. In the 1700s, slavery in West African societies had shifted from being this kind of minor thing to more of a central institution. Most African rulers participated in the slave trade, although often in ways that were most beneficial to them. The slave trade made Africa a major market for European goods, especially textiles and guns. What this did is it disrupted relations within and among African societies in ways that encouraged competing for power, goods, and access to slaves. Of course, the loss of tens of thousands of men and women to the slave trade weakened and distorted West Africa's economy and society. The voyage across the Atlantic Ocean was called the Middle Passage. It was a very harrowing experience for slaves. Since a slave could be sold in America for 20 or 30 times their price in Africa, slave traders crammed as many slaves as tightly on the ships as possible. And given such conditions, only a small percentage, about 1 in 5 slaves died before they could even reach the Americas, and of those that survived, only a small percentage were sold and stayed in North American colonies. Because the colonies had a lower death rate than the colonies in the West Indies and Brazil, where slave plantation conditions and work were much more brutal. The British colonies of North America imported between 400,000 and 600,000 slaves, and by 1770, due to slave natural reproduction, 1/5 of the 2.3 million people in the English colonies, and this is not including Indians, were Africans or their descendants. Here we see a mid-18th century, so we're talking 1750s image of a woman going to church in Lima, Peru. You can see that she's accompanied by 2 slaves. This really just kind of points out to us that slavery existed throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. And this map shows us the Atlantic trading route that crisscrossed the Atlantic, bringing both manufactured goods to Africa and to Britain's American colonies, slaves to the New World, colonial products to Europe. You can see each line has a label on it that'll show you kind of what was going where and where it was coming from. This map shows us the slave trade in the Atlantic world. It shows the Middle Passage and from West Africa, kind of the percentage of who received slave trade during this time period. We're talking 1460 to 1770. See, the mainland colonies received only a tiny proportion of the Africans that were brought to the New World. Most of them were transported to Brazil and to the West Indies. By the mid-18th century, there were 3 distinct slave systems in British North America. So we're talking about the colonies. We have the tobacco-based plantation slavery in the Chesapeake region, the rice-based plantation slavery in South Carolina and Georgia, and non-plantation slavery in New England and the Middle Colonies. The tobacco plantations of the Chesapeake, where nearly half of the region's population in 1770 were slaves, so we're talking half of the entire population were slaves in this region. This was the largest and oldest of the 3. It extended deep inland. Slavery in Virginia existed on large plantations and in many small farms. Slavery had created the Chesapeake elite, the gentry who dominated the region's society and politics, and in conjunction with merchants in the tobacco trade, lawyers defending the interests of slaveholders. Slavery transformed the Chesapeake society into an elaborate hierarchy of degrees of freedom. We have our large planters at the top, lesser planters and land owning other men below them, and at the bottom of the large population of indentured servants, tenant farmers, convicts, and then slaves. Though planters made more laws enhancing the power of masters over their slave property, violence, such as whipping, was at the center of the institution and its perpetuation. As slavery became entrenched, race became a more significant line of social division. Whites more and more saw free blacks as dangerous and unwanted and began to restrict their rights that had been given to them earlier, things like gun ownership, the right to vote, for free landowning black men. Because Virginia by law required freed slaves to leave the colony, free blacks remained a very small part of the population. And we saw that last week in our readings on slavery and how the institution of slavery had changed. In the Rice Kingdom, we're talking about the rice plantation system of slavery that had developed in South Carolina and Georgia. This institution of slavery first had relied on Indians as slaves, some of whom the colony exported along with deerskins and furs. Some tribes, like the Creeks, first participated in Indian slave trade, starting wars with other tribes just to secure captives for the trade. But the Creeks and other Indian tribes, fearing enslavement and other English abuses, rebelled. So this encouraged the Carolina colonists to turn elsewhere for their labor force. Rice cultivation in the low country of South Carolina prompted the importation of African slaves there and led to a growing racial divide between whites and blacks. South Carolina was the first colony to have a black majority. By the 1730s, when North Carolina became its own colony, 2/3 of its population was black. Indigo, which was a crop used for blue dye, also became a staple crop there in the 1740s and was cultivated on slave plantations. Africans familiar with the crop at home actually taught the colonists how to grow rice. As opposed to the Chesapeake, where slaves were worked constantly in gangs, slaves on the rice plantations worked more in a task system, which means they were assigned a daily job, which, once it was completed, they did have time, some quote-unquote leisure time, and time to grow crops on their own. Going back to the Middle Passage, when we talked about the ships and the traders trying to get as many people on a ship as possible, you can see this is the architect's plan for a slave trip, or a slave ship, sorry. This is the slave trading vessel. I'm not going to attempt to say the name. The drawings show the conditions, how it was laid out for where slaves would lay. If you look in the third ship over, you can see all of those are where they expected the slaves to stay and lay on their way across the Middle Passage. You can see this is a picture of the overseer doing his duty. This photograph or this picture was a watercolor by Benjamin Latrobe, sketched in Virginia. It's kind of meant to be ironic a little bit. You've got the well-dressed overseer relaxing, two female workers working in the field. Rice cultivation had also developed in Georgia. It was founded in 1733 by philanthropists led by James Oglethorpe. He was a wealthy reformer, favored the abolition of slavery. Oglethorpe had wanted to create a colony in which the worthy poor of England could find economic opportunity. So the British government wanted the colony as a defensive barrier against the Spanish and their Indian allies in Florida, however. So although the colony initially had banned liquor and slaves, most of the settlers wanted both. And so by the 1740s, colonists were appealing for the English liberty of self-government in order to have slaves. So in 1751, Georgia's proprietors surrendered the colony to the crown, which means they gave over control that they had and gave it to the British Crown, making Georgia a royal colony. Then the Crown repealed the ban on slavery and liquor, and Georgia quickly became very close to South Carolina, in which it had large rice plantations, supported wealthy planter class that dominated the colony. Compared to the plantation areas, the New England and Middle colonies were mostly areas of small farms where slavery was not central. Slaves were only a very small percentage of the population, and even wealthy families rarely owned more than one slave. Slaves worked as farm labor, in artisan shops, on the docks, and as personal servants. Slaves in the North, however, sometimes had more legal rights than their southern counterparts. In New England, slaves could not be severely physically punished. Slaves could bring suits in court, and they could be married, and their marriages were recognized. A significant number of slaves were present both in New York and Philadelphia, although many employers of the slave labor turned to wage labor in the years before the American Revolution. This next picture is of Henry Darnall III, painted around 1710 by Kuhn, who produced many portraits of prominent Marylanders, 18th century. You can see the boy is clearly the son of somebody who's very wealthy in the colony. He's standing next to a young slave. This really symbolizes a family's wealth. If you had even just one slave in the Union colonies, this was significant. You had to have extensive wealth even in order to have one slave. The background, you can see very idealized European palace, a formal garden, very fancy. This is a slave sale broadside. It was from 1769, advertises for the sale of 94 slaves who had just arrived in Charleston from West Africa. Broadsides like this were displayed a lot by slave traders in order to drum up business. It's advertisements for slaves and for the slave trade. You can see in this 1741 painting of the Potter family of Nantucket, Rhode Island. You see the young African American boy serving tea. Really demonstrates that slavery did exist in the 18th century all throughout the colonies. In this next section, we're going to be looking at what factors led to a distinct African American cultures in the 18th century, how they were different in the different regions, what it meant to become African American. Africans had brought to the mainland colonies in the 17th century a very diverse culture because they were coming from diverse African cultures. They had different languages, different religions. For most of the 18th century, the majority of American slaves were born in Africa. And so they really truly were African American people coming with a cohesive culture that was shaped by African, European, and American influences. This really emerged gradually through the common experience of slavery. One of the biggest and most difficult transitions for enslaved Africans was the forced change from their traditional religions to that of Christianity, which was the dominant religion of their colonial captors. While many of the forced migrants believed in a universal creator, the similarities between various African religious practices seemed to resemble Native American communities more than the Christianity. While some enslaved individuals were familiar with Christianity or Islam, most who ended up in British North America came from the more isolated forest regions of West Africa. Even in the 18th century, many continued to practice their traditional African religious practices, or melded them with more Protestant forms of Christianity or Catholicism, depending on which region they were in and what the dominant religion was of that region in the Americas. The three different slave systems in British North America also produced three different distinct African American cultures. In the Chesapeake, a healthy climate led to more natural reproduction of the slave population, had more balanced men and women, created the family-centered slave community. Continuously exposed to white culture, slaves here learned English, were influenced by religious revivalism. In South Carolina and Georgia, so in our rice plantations, the conditions were very harsh. It created a very different culture. There was very low birth rates, which meant there was continuous slave importation. And since slaves seldom encountered whites and had more autonomy than those on other kinds of plantations, they had a more African culture. In the northern colonies, where slaves were such a small part of the population and dispersed as individuals or small groups throughout the white population, there was a distinct African American culture developing very slowly there. In this table, you can see the slave population's percentage of the total population of the colony. So you can see you have in the first column the colony, the number of slaves, and then you can look on the furthest to the right. That's the percentage of that colony's population that were slaves in 1770. Despite the differences between the three cultures, all of them were linked by the experience of slavery and the hope for freedom. The most common of slave resistance was to run away, and in some colonies, fugitive slaves found it easy to assume the identity of a free black individual. Much less common were slave uprisings. The first occurred in New York in 1712, in which a group of slaves burned buildings, killed whites who arrived, and were later executed, some being tortured and burned alive as a warning to the city's slave population. Imperial wars in 1730 and 1740s opened the door for slave resistance in Louisiana and the West Indies. In 1739, we have the War of Jenkins' Ear between England and Spain, which prompted a group of South Carolina slaves to seize arms at Stono. They marched towards the safety of Spanish Florida, which had offered security to escaped British slaves. They killed whites, shouting liberty as they went. This was called the Stono Rebellion, and it was crushed by colonial militia and led to the tightening of South Carolina's slave laws. In 1741, in New York City, a panic induced by a series of fires led to rumors that slaves were planning to mount a rebellion with white allies and turn the city over to the Spanish. So during that uprising, or feared uprising, more than 150 blacks and a few whites were arrested, and 34 people, including 4 whites, were executed. You can see here we have an advertisement seeking the return of a runaway slave from Port Royal in the Sea Islands of South Carolina. Mustee was a term that was used for a person of mixed European and African ancestry. So you can see that this runaway slave that they are looking for is a mixed African slave. So African and European ancestry. This is from 1747. In this next section, we're going to be looking at what did it mean to be free, or what did the different terms of liberty, or what did liberty mean in British 18th century. Although slavery was vital to the British Empire, the British people in the 18th century believed that their society was the most free and it was the most advanced nation in the world. Great Britain was the world's greatest commercial and naval power, had a complex government with a powerful parliament representing the interests of both people who own land, people who own the business as well. London was the political, cultural, and economical capital of the empire, and it was the largest city in Europe with nearly 1 million residents. The empire enjoyed a common law, common language, and despite small numbers of Catholics, Jews, and Africans, a common devotion to Protestantism. Britain often found itself at war with France, which had replaced Spain as its European Catholic rival. This stimulated a large military establishment, high taxes, and a Bank of England to help finance its wars in Europe and the empire. These wars helped to develop a sense of national identity, the fact that they're fighting against a common foe. And in contrast to France, Britain was celebrated by its people as a nation of widespread prosperity and individual liberty. It was ruled by laws and Protestantism. Liberty, especially as it was embodied in what came to be called the British Constitution, was central to this emerging British identity. Britons believed that the legacy of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution had given them this unique, ideal political order over institutions that had guaranteed their freedoms, the rule of law, legislation, consent to be consented by representatives, restraints on arbitrary authority, and individual rights like trial by jury were enshrined in the common law. Writers in mainland Europe looked to England as a model government, and thinkers such as French political philosopher Baron Montesquieu praised Britain for its balanced constitution, where we have the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the King all checking one another's power. In Great Britain, no man, not even the king, was above the law, and Britons believed their political system prevented tyranny, barbarism, and they also believed which they enslaved others elsewhere in Europe and the empire. However, slavery and the other negations of freedom made liberty far from universal in the British Empire, meaning it did not apply to everyone. Now, ideas of British liberty expanded beyond the political nation. Those who voted, held office, and engaged in structured political debates, to all members of British society, which included laborers, sailors, artisans, and even slaves. Liberty came to mean more than just privileges derived from membership in a distinct social class. It became defined as a general right to resist arbitrary government. When ordinary people invoked liberty, critiqued tyranny and collective action, sometimes against merchants charging them above what they felt was a just price, or officers of the Royal Navy engaging in impressment, kidnapping poor men in the public service for the Navy's ships. Liberty was central to two sets of political ideas in the English world, the Anglo-American world. Today they are called republicanism and liberalism by scholars, but they were not used in this way at the time. Republicanism celebrated participation in public life by economically independent citizens as the basis of liberty. Republicans at this time believed that only citizens who owned property had virtue, defined as the willingness to subordinate self-interest to common public good. Okay, in Britain, republicanism was most associated with men who criticized corruption in politics, calling, for example, for fewer members of the House of Commons to be appointed by and dependent on the crown. These Republicans believed that a corrupt Britain was in danger of really succumbing to luxury and manipulation, which would result in a loss of virtue and thus a loss of liberty. Their writings were more influential in the colonies than in Britain itself. Liberalism in the 18th century British Empire meant something quite different than we define liberalism today. While republicanism had a public and social quality, liberalism was very much more individual and private. John Locke was liberalism's leading philosopher. His two treatises of government was written in 1680, was very influential in the 1700s. Locke argued that governments were constituted through a social contract, mutually agreed upon by equals. In his time, he's really talking about male heads of the household, in which these individuals are surrendering part of their right to govern themselves in order to enjoy the benefits of the rule of law, so the security of their life, their liberty, and their property. Protecting these required limiting the interference of the state in religious, family, and economic life. Locke's ideas of individual rights, the consent of the governed, and the right to rebel against unjust or oppressive government became very familiar in Britain and its colonies. Nevertheless, Locke's idea of liberty as a universal right seemed to exclude many from its benefits, as its imagined free individual was in theory and in practice really just a man who was white and owned property. While distinct bodies of thought, republicanism and liberalism overlapped and reinforced each other, they both came to influence and inspire Americans to resist British rule. You can see here in this picture, this painting of Prime Minister William Pitt addressing the House of Commons. Even though that less than 5% of the British population enjoy the right to vote, we do see representative government as being very central to 18th century idea of freedom. You can see here in 1770, this engraving from the Boston Gazette. This was by Paul Revere. Paul Revere was a very popular artist in Boston. He's illustrating the association of British patriotism and liberty. Britannia, which is the woman, sits with a liberty cap and her national shield, and she's releasing a bird from a cage. Here we see the polling by the renowned 18th century British artist William Hogarth. This really is more satirical, kind of making fun of the idea that the British elections are decided by the reasoned deliberations of upstanding property owners. This is really inspired by a corrupt election in 1754. He's showing the election scene where the maimed and dying are brought to the polls to cast ballots. At the center, lawyers are arguing over whether this man who has a hook for a hand is able to swear on the Bible. Here we can see this is the title page of John Locke's Two Treatises of Government. Remember, this document really looks at government and its origins to this original state of nature and really insists on political authorities not going against the rights of individuals. And here's a picture of John Locke himself. This is painted in probably 1696. Now in this next section, looking at the public sphere, we're going to be looking at what kind of concepts and institutions had dominated colonial politics in the 18th century. First of these is the right to vote. In some ways, politics in the 18th century colonial America seemed more democratic than in Britain. As in Britain, property ownership was the one qualification for voting, which ensured that men with an economic stake in society and the independence of judgment that came with property determined government policies. Dependents, who lacked their own will, such as slaves, servants, adult sons living in their parents' home, the poor, women, all were ineligible to vote. The wide distribution of land ownership in America meant that there was a far higher percentage of the population that had the right to vote than compared to Europe. In some colonies, free blacks with property could vote. Some colonies also denied the vote to religious minorities like Jews and Catholics and dissenting Protestants, while everywhere Indians were generally prohibited from voting. In colonial America, the people existed only on election day. And so we're talking about the people in quotation marks. We want to think of the idea of we the people. Competitive elections were very rare, and usually voters deferred to their social betters in their community, who expected voters to support them because of their patronage, their reputation, or their social status. Real power resided in officials who were appointed, not elected. Governors and councils were appointed by the crown or the proprietors, the people who started the colonies, everywhere except Rhode Island and Connecticut, where they were elected. In some colonies, such as South Carolina, the property qualification for office holding was far higher than that for the vote, which ensured that only the wealthy could be elected. Few ordinary Americans pursued elective office or were even very active in public affairs. You can see this engraving depicts the 1764 Pennsylvania election, really suggesting the intensity of the political debate in the Middle Colonies. Now, concerned with events in Europe and over imperial rivalries in the colonies, British governments in the first half of the 18th century followed this policy of salutary neglect, which they allowed the American colonies mostly to govern themselves. This, in effect, gave large landowners, business owners, and lawyers more power to control local colonial politics, while elected representatives in colonial assemblies believed they represented the popular will and used their power over colonial finance and taxes to influence policy and appointed officials. In the 18th century, as economic development increased, the power of the American elites, colonial assemblies, became more assertive, and they insisted that they controlled local affairs in the colonies as much as the House of Commons did in Britain. The most successful governors accommodated the ascendant assemblies and used patronage, such as land grants, in order to win support. So they would give land to people in order to get their vote. Eliminating the Governor's Council, Pennsylvania's legislature was the most powerful. But New York, Virginia, South Carolina, and especially Massachusetts also had powerful assemblies. Colonial representatives invoked liberal and Republican notions of liberty in making their claims on colonial and imperial officials. Politics in public, the discussion of politics in public was what we would call the public sphere. This is a space where political organization and debate, independent of the government, took place, where we see your informed citizens openly discussing questions that previously were only addressed by officials. In Boston, New York, and Philadelphia, different clubs emerged that debated literature, philosophical, scientific, political issues. The best known was the Junto, and this was founded by Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia in 1727. A club that later became known as the American Philosophical Society. Now, compared to other European colonies in the Western Hemisphere, British North America had a very literate population with a vibrant press. That's not to say that everyone could read and everyone was literate. It just means in comparison to the rest of the empire, a greater percentage of the population were literate. Newspapers, circulating libraries were especially important in spreading information and ideas, and expanding the public sphere. By 1730s, political commentary was prevalent in American newspapers. The best edited newspaper was probably Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette, which was founded in 1728, had at its peak about 2,000 readers. 2,000 people reading that at this time. Now you can see this, talking a little bit more about Benjamin Franklin, was his chart that he would use along his quest for self-improvement. He called it his temperance diagram. Or as he put it in his autobiography, Moral Perfection. He charts his behavior each day of the week with regards to 13 different virtues. They're listed on the left by their first letters, and so these are temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. You can see he did not always adhere to all 13 virtues on any given day, or some of them on any day. Now, America had a vibrant press. Freedom of expression, freedom of speech were not the norm within the press. And there was not a traditional right for ordinary Britons to have freedom of speech and freedom of press. Freedom of speech had developed in the 1500s as a right for legislators in Parliament in order for them to be able to really truly represent, for facilitating representation. Outside of Parliament, however, free speech had no legal protection. Governments in Britain and the colonies viewed freedom of the press as very dangerous, and only in 1695 was it possible to print a newspaper, a book, or a pamphlet without the government's permission. After this, the government could censor print matter only after it had been published. Editors of colonial newspapers that criticized officials or legislatures were frequently punished, leading some Americans to call for the freedom of the press, which was not often observed. The most famous court case in the colonies that regarding this issue of freedom of the press showed that most colonists opposed prosecutions of those criticizing public officials. In 1735, the German-born printer John Peter Zenger, who had accused New York's governor of corruption, was arrested for seditious libel. His lawyer, Alexander Hamilton, asked the jury to judge the accuracy of Zenger's statements, not whether he printed them, and he was found not guilty. While libel remained a crime, the trial's outcome spread in the colonies the belief that newspapers should be allowed to print the truth without fear of punishment, and helped to popularize this idea of freedom of expression. We have a picture of Benjamin Franklin, of course, a very famous symbolic American. Now, in the 18th century, many educated Americans began to be influenced by the European Enlightenment. This was a philosophical movement with its origins in France that sought to apply political and social life, to apply to them the scientific method of investigation and experimentation. Enlightenment thinkers demanded that every human institution, authority, and tradition be judged by the measure of reason. Benjamin Franklin, who established a newspaper debating club, library, published Poor Richard's Almanac, and conducted experiments showed that lightning is electricity, embodied the spirit of enlightenment. Critical of the religious wars that had engulfed Europe, Enlightenment thinkers hoped that reason, not religious enthusiasm, would then rule human affairs. These philosophers, being skeptical of all traditions and authorities, easily criticized established churches. Many prominent Americans embraced Arminianism, which taught that reason alone could form the basis of religion, or deism, a belief that God had withdrawn from the world after creating it, leaving it to function according to natural scientific laws without divine intervention. In the 1600s, English scientist Isaac Newton had discovered and demonstrated the natural laws that govern the universe. Now, while many Protestants affirmed Newton's findings, arguing it was evidence of God's work in maintaining their piety, deists believed that the best form of religious devotion was to study nature, not to worship in organized churches. Prominent American deists in the late colonial era included Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. This is a picture of the New York Weekly Journal. This was edited by John Peter Zenger, and one of 4 issues that was to be burned by local authorities when he was under trial. Now in this next section we're going to be looking at the Great Awakening, seeing how it challenged both the religious and social structure of British North America. Religion was central to the 18th century colonial American life. Bible and other religious publications were the largest category of printed material, and religious disputes often garnered more attention than political issues. By the 1720s and 1730s, however, many ministers feared that westward expansion, a lack of individual engagement in church activities, and the growth of business and Enlightenment rationalism was threatening religious devotion. These fears helped inspire a series of revivals across the colonies, later known as the Great Awakening, that were less coordinated movement than local events dedicated to an emotional and personal experience of Christianity. Ministers such as Massachusetts Congregationalist Jonathan Edwards pioneered an emotional form of preaching, portraying man in his sermon, sinners in the hands of a God, as a sinner on the verge of being condemned to damnation at any moment, and only by experiencing new birth could he be saved. Particularly important to spreading the revivals was the English minister George Whitefield, who spread the Great Awakening through the colonies during a 2-year tour of America starting in 1739. Newspapers promoted his tour. Tens of thousands flocked to hear him in what was the first major intercolonial event in North American history. Many members of the established churches criticized the revivalists for their lack of theological training, their emotionalism, and the disorder they caused. But the Great Awakening transformed the religious life of America, split the old churches and created new churches like the Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian. And the Great Awakening was to a great extent supported by the poor and disenfranchised, and it caused some to question other authorities and institutions in colonial America. You can see here a picture of Jonathan Edwards, one of the most prominent preachers of the Great Awakening, and also George Whitefield. One of the things you want to keep in mind is that one of the big ideals being preached during the Great Awakening was this idea that one did not have to rely on the authority of a pastor or a priest, but one should look to their individual understanding of what they were reading and seeing in the Bible. And so it's important to notice that as this Great Awakening is happening, it is not surprising that fairly soon the colonists are going to question the authority of the British Empire. If they're willing to question the authority of those that previously had their eternal lives in their hand, the power to determine where they would spend all of eternity, why would they not then question the crown and parliament as well, the authority of that? So keep that in mind as well. In this next section, we're going to be looking at the Spanish and French empires developing in America as well. We've been focused quite a bit on the English Empire. Now we're going to look at the Spanish and the French in addition to that. Now, as Britain's North American colonies grew, there were rivalries all over North America, and they began to intensify. While the colonies of France and Spain, their territory was very large, they were very much smaller in population and less economically developed. The Spanish Empire stretched from the Pacific coast to New Mexico and the Great Plains of Texas and Florida, and after 1763 it included Louisiana. But its presence consisted of only a few small outposts. Spanish efforts to reinvigorate its older colonies in 1700 floundered. They feared Russian settlement. Spanish successfully colonized with missions and presidios on most of the coast of California, but the diseases they introduced and the resettlement of Indians resulted in the near total devastation of California's native population. The French were a far greater threat to the British power in North America. During the 18th century, the French population and the economy of Canada had expanded. French traders pushed south from the Great Lakes and north from Mobile and New Orleans. By 1750, there were about 10,000 French colonists and slaves living in Louisiana, mostly working around sugar plantations. Although much smaller in population and economic power than British colonies, the French colonies, especially in their alliance with powerful Native American tribes, really posed a great threat to the English Empire. You can see in this map Spanish influence, French, and British settlement. So you can see that the Spanish and the French had far greater territory, but much smaller population. This is a lithograph from 1816 of Indians performing a dance at a mission in San Francisco. You see the priest watching from the front of the mission church. This is a sketch of New Orleans as it appeared in 1720. Now, in this next section, we're going to be looking at the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War. Okay, we're going to see the impact on the relationships between the French, the English, and the Native Americans. So, the western frontier of British America, particularly the Ohio Valley, was a battleground that saw nearly constant conflict between the French, British, and their Indian allies, who were mostly tribes that had been pushed there by European settlement. On this middle ground between European empires and Indian sovereignty, Indians from various tribes lived together, alongside European traders and missionaries. Indians of the Ohio Valley both learned to play the British and the French off of each other in a very dangerous diplomatic game, and were victims of their European and Indian enemies in the cultural changes they wrought. In 1749, as white settlers began moving into the Ohio Valley, Virginia awarded an immense grant of land there to the Ohio Company, who then could sell the land to the settlers. This grant threatened the valley's Indians and caused the French to reinforce their presence. The Ohio Company's demand for French recognition of its land claims inaugurated or started the 7 Years' War. Now, this was known in the colonies as the French and Indian War, so we're talking about the same thing. The British had fought its rivals, France and Spain, in 3 inconclusive wars earlier in the 18th century, and had to finance these wars. British public expenditures, taxes, and national debt had greatly increased, which inspired discontent at home and in the colonies. The 7 Years' War saw fighting among these global empires across the entire globe, what was truly the First World War. It started in 1754 with British efforts to dislodge the French from forts in western Pennsylvania guarding the Ohio Valley. When a small force of soldiers led by George Washington entered the area, conflict ensued. For the first 2 years of the war, French and Indian forces successfully attacked the frontiers of the British colonies in North America. Only in 1757, under Prime Minister Pitt's leadership, did the British government turn the tide. Britain funded Prussia and Austria's campaigns against France and its ally Spain in Europe, while the British struck back in the colonies. By 1760, British forces had captured the major outposts of New France, seized French possessions in the Caribbean, and had established control of India. In the Peace of Paris in 1763, France ceded Canada to Britain and received in return the Sugar Islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique. Spain ceded Florida to Britain in return for the Philippines and Cuba, which the British had seized during the war. Spain also acquired Louisiana from the French, and France's empire in North America was finished. However, attempts to pay for the cost of war led to events that precipitated the French and American Revolution. You can see in this map of upstate New York by Governor William Tryon of colonial New York demonstrates the area was considered the realm of the 6 Iroquois nations, whose domain also stretched into the Ohio Valley. This is the cover of a magazine that was published in Pennsylvania in 1758. It shows an Englishman and a Frenchman attempting to trade with an Indian. The Frenchman offers a tomahawk and a musket, the Englishman a Bible and cloth, and of course the depiction of these 2 Europeans really do reflect the pro-British stereotypes. Now, the French defeat upset this balance of power or diplomacy that had enabled Indian groups like the Iroquois to maintain a degree of autonomy, and they saw Britain's victory and its colonies as a threat. The French conceded lands the Indians controlled to the British without their consent, and the Treaty of Paris caused confusion about land claims, control of the fur trade, and tribal relations in general. In 1763, Indians in the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes regions rebelled against British rule. Although it was named Pontiac's Rebellion after an Ottawa warrior, in fact, Newlin, a Delaware religious prophet, inspired much of the rebellion with visions that urged Indians to reject European technologies, commercial relations, and alcohol, and to expel the British from their lands. He also encouraged Indians of different tribes to consider themselves all Indians, forging a pan-Indian identity for the first time. By the end of 1763, British forces had quelled the rebellion, but the British government tried to quiet tensions between white settlers in the colonies and Indians by declaring the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited further colonial settlement in the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. Reserved these lands for the Indians. It also banned the sale of Indian lands to private individuals, allowed sales only to colonial governments. The new policy enraged settlers and speculators who wanted these lands, and many colonists, including George Washington, ignored the policy and purchased land anyway, illegally. So not solving the issue of westward expansion, the act instead exacerbated Indian colonial relations. We can see in this map of eastern North America after the Peace of Paris that ended the 7 Years' War, that left all of North America east of the Mississippi in British hands. All of the tan areas British hands. Green is Spanish, and you'll notice French in the continent. Now, the 7 Years' War changed all of the American colonies, but changed Pennsylvania the most. The war had shattered the rule of the old Quaker elite, ended their policy of accommodating the Indians as well. Many Western settlers pushed the colony's government into a more aggressive stance toward the Indians during the war, and the brutal warfare on the colony's frontier deepened Western farmers' antagonism toward the Indians. During Pontiac's Rebellion, a group of armed Western farmers from Paxton marched on Philadelphia, attacking and massacring Indians along the way. Paxton Boys successfully pressured the governor into expelling peaceful Indians in that city, and by the end of the 1760s, Penn's holy experiment and his quest for peace between Europeans and Indians was over. Colonists also emerged from the war with a greater sense of collective identity. Before the war, the colonies had been isolated from one another. If it had been approved in 1754, the Albany Plan of Union, which was drafted by Benjamin Franklin, would have created an intercolonial legislature consisting of delegates from each colony, which would have power to levy taxes and conduct diplomacy with Indian tribes. However, it was rejected by colonial assemblies. Now, although some tensions had arisen between American and British soldiers and officers during the war mostly intensified British or American colonists' sense of themselves as Britons, with all the benefits that came from being British. American colonists believed that British triumph in the war was a victory for Protestant freedom against Popish slavery. France's defeat reinforced the inflation of British identity with Protestantism and freedom, and soon American colonists would come to believe that they could no longer protect their particularly British liberties within the British Empire. Now, this famous cartoon by Benjamin Franklin, Join or Die. You can see all of the colonies represented by different parts of the snake. He was calling them to join the Albany Plan of Union, calling British North American colonies to unite against the French. That is all for chapter 4.